Hello, everyone. It's Shane Kanto, your Wasteland reviewer, and welcome to Lost in the Wasteland, my weekly interview show where I learn a little bit more about somebody else's perspective on movies. And I have a special guest this week, filmmaker Harry Waldman. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. And Harry, if you want to take a minute to, let the audience know a little bit about yourself and your work.
Yeah, of course. So I've always loved watching movies ever since I
Mhm.
was a little kid. But I suppose in my younger years, I guess I get it from my grandpa. Awesome guy, did so much for me. He was a more business-like kind of 2 plus 2 equals 4 kind of guy. So
Mhm.
he kind of had a slight influence on me, kind of convinced me to go into business, which I am glad I studied business in school, mainly because it taught me how to be a leader. It's
Mhm.
definitely helped for me producing my films, which I've learned over the years how much work being a producer is. I did not anticipate that before I ever produced the film. With that being said, though, a lot of the content I was studying in school just didn't really interest me that much, and I guess I was a little too practical for my own good. So
Mhm.
I kind of went through my younger years not paying attention in class, just thinking, well, you're gonna have a 9 to 5 or nine to whatever job after school, and you're not gonna like it very much. You're gonna suck it up, and I guess that's it. And the thought really depressed me, so I kind of just tried not to think about it too much. Fortunately for me, I the light bulb kind of came on in my head. The unfortunate news was I came to the realization that I wanted to be a filmmaker actually after having this dream about going to film school, right about as I was graduating college. So it was a little frustrating, especially I went to Ithaca College in upstate New York, and they're actually pretty known for their film school. And I had a few friends who were in the film school there. So while it was a little frustrating that I realized what I wanted to do as I was leaving school, I figured better to figure it out, when you're 21 years old than
Mhm.
many years later. So yeah, basically after that, I worked in finance for about 5 years to pay the bills, and I slowly started to pursue filmmaking. I first watched a lot of YouTube videos. I read a couple books, just kind of scoured the internet for anything that could help, and then I started networking a bit. And one of the first networking events I went to, I met this guy Eugene, and he's a semi well-known indie filmmaker in Chicago, and he had been at the time. So he brought me onto one of his films, um, and that led to me meeting the producer, an individual named Lance, who I'm still close with. And he really was a mentor for me after that. So he kind of took me onto his films first as a production assistant, then as assistant camera, assistant lighting, and kind of as a return favor for helping him out on those projects. I had kind of been dabbling in filmmaking. I made this one fun, kind of stupid film called 515 by myself, and I had written the script for Enter the Room, and he had taken a look at the script, and he dug it. He liked the voices of the characters, and kind of as a return favor, he ended up helping produce and shoot the film. So it was really valuable meeting him and seeing him go through the whole production process. From getting an assistant director to posting casting notices to holding auditions to hiring the proper talent to rehearsal all the way to the end of the shoot. So seeing him do that made me realize that even though I didn't have the film background and necessarily the connections at the time, that this is something that I could do. And I kind of took what I learned from him and used it for my next few films. A couple shorts I made, In the Backseat and Bay for Blood, and then a feature film which is currently still in post production, The Corridor Crossing. So I've kind of just slowly built and expanded, and made many mistakes, but tried to learn and improve from there. And yeah, right now I have another feature film, Incautious, which I'm currently working on the script. I'm hoping to have that in a production next fall. And then I have a short animated film called Slivered, which I've never made an animated film before, so it's been a bit rough, but it's been a lot of
Mhm.
fun. I'm working on that with my dad, who's a professional artist. And yeah, that basically takes me to where I am right now.
So I could definitely relate in terms of I have a undergrad and master's in accounting, and realizing well into my educational experience is like I don't think this is exactly what I want to do with my life. and figuring that out. So I could definitely appreciate that little part of your journey for sure. And also thank you for sharing your perspective on, getting into making films and your connections. And I'd love to talk to you a little bit specifically about Enter the Room, which I got the opportunity to check out. Well, I know the film really focuses on this relationship between these two brothers, but specifically, where did you feel like you had those, like the inspiration of having this story really focusing on that kind of relationship?
Yeah, of course. So fun fact about Under the Room, it was loosely based on a relationship I had with a roommate my freshman year of
Okay.
college. um, yeah, it was so I'd say 80 to 90% of the various things that
Mhm,
the uptight one Brian gets on Jeremy's case about, these were actual things that my roommate said to me, accused me of. Things got very tense, and there
mhm,
there did end up being a pretty big argument near the end of us living with each other. Not quite as intense as the big argument
mhm,
between Brian and Jeremy. So yeah, it was definitely a rough experience, but I guess two things. One, every roommate I've had since him has seemed amazing. So, and two, I honestly really am glad I met him, because if I didn't, I wouldn't have come up with this idea for Enter the
mhm,
Room. In addition to it being loosely based on the relationship I had with the roommate in college, I wanted to take it a step further. I felt like that was a good basis for kind of the first 50 to 70% of the film. But
mhm,
then I figured, why not make them brothers? Why not give them this kind of disturbing backstory that sort of shaped who they've become and where they are now? And I actually didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, it hadn't been that long after I'd watched Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and I
mhm,
kind of realized, oh yeah, there's a little bit of a parallel between the one sister resenting the other and kind of treating her poorly, and then you finding out sort of, oh, what happened between them versus the two brothers. So it was
mhm.
interesting though that when I came up with the idea, I didn't realize actively that that was partially where the influence came from, but then kind of later it came to me.
Awesome. It's certainly relatable in terms of anybody who went away to college and, had a dorm with somebody else and realizing it's like you're not always going to see eye to eye on things and having those kinds of dynamics. And I thought it was a very interesting layer to make them brothers. And honestly, sitting watching this, it made me really think about what would it be like if I was trying to be my brother's roommate. And I'm very much the everything is organized and like to like where it has. And to be honest, it reminded me a little bit about my dynamic with my wife, who honestly it's like everything is everywhere. Kind of dynamic, but I appreciate the layers that there's a lot to relate to and connect here. And also appreciate the feeling because like usually those are questions I like to ask in terms of like, are there any particular films that you feel like they've had a connection to? And that definitely adds some context in terms of where this was coming from. And I guess one other question that I had in terms of because there's different ways you could approach a story like this, and it was a very interesting one, like ratcheting it up to the point where it's like this is like horror thriller kind of vibe. So, what was that? Where do you feel like that influence was like taking it in that direction and going to that point in terms of the story?
I think that, well, initially when I wrote it, because I know every storyteller is different, and I've definitely
Mhm,
met some, and I don't think there's anything wrong with this, especially if you've been doing it for a while and you want a certain reaction. Where a filmmaker, storyteller might think, okay, well, this is a horror film, I want to make it scary. This is a comedy, I want to make it funny, and I didn't necessarily think in those terms. I
mhm,
more just started with, like I'd mentioned a bit earlier, I had this I had this rough relationship with this roommate, and we just grinded gears, and it just felt like every little thing I did ran him up a wall. And but it was like, even though I thought he was being a bit extreme, I am a bit uptight, and I'm actually a bit of a
mhm,
clean freak too. So I did inject a little bit of myself into Brian, even though I wouldn't necessarily, I don't have a roommate where I've gone nearly that far if
mhm,
he was a little messy. So it kind of just came from this feeling like I need to get this story off my chest. As for the sort of going into the thriller horror aspect of it, I suppose just stylistically,
Mm,
some filmmakers, Gaspar Noé, not a filmmaker
mm.
everyone's familiar with, but I'm a huge fan, and he's widely respected, but I'd say pretty polarizing filmmaker. Very,
Yes, for
very
sure.
extreme colors, like definitely not feel good movies. I've been a fan of his for a while, but I first got into him in college, and they're definitely, particularly with those bright flashing lights,
Mhm,
there's definitely some influence stylistically from him. And then I would just say some other influences would be I tried to put my own spin on it, but for sure the sort of twist near the end, Fight Club was an influence.
mm,
I'd say some darker, twistier films, just like older Christopher Nolan, Memento, one of my
mm.
absolute favorite films of all time, Donnie Darko, even just directors like David Fincher and Darren Aronofsky, just stylistically, who that tonally darker and bolder and more daring. Just yeah, so I'd say those are some of the influences for sure.
I'll certainly admit, I don't think I'll ever forget my theater going experience to see Climax. Um,
Yeah.
that I did not know what I was getting into, going to see that film, and sitting in the theater, I think there was only like four of us there. There was a lot of very visceral reactions to that experience. So I could definitely understand that kind of like ratcheting up that kind of tension. And certainly the a lot of those influences make a lot of sense. And this was a film that honestly, because like I mentioned, like I was connecting with on like the thematic levels and the experiential level, and this really took me by surprise. And that the progression of this story certainly was like, oh, I did not see this coming or where this was going to take me. And I was really impressed by the experience. So I did appreciated the opportunity to check out your film.
Thanks. I really appreciate that, and I love to hear it, especially because I was a little worried with the twist at the end.
Hmm,
I suppose as I mentioned, I didn't want to just copy Fight Club, so I put a little extra twist on it. But I was a
yeah,
little worried that I was going to have a number of people, kind of stating, "Oh yeah, I saw that coming." So I really appreciate that.
absolutely. And I guess how I always like to wrap up discussing a project with a filmmaker is if you could give that like one specific reason why people should go check out Enter the Room.
I think I would say one, if you've ever had a you've ever lived with someone, whether it's a sibling or yeah, just someone in college or someone you roomed with after college, and things have ever been a little tense or a bit rough, it might initially be a bit frustrating for you to watch, but that it could be a bit cathartic in a sense.
Mhm,
I would say that would be number one. If I would just add a slight second, is that I try to, particularly with my anti-heroes, villains, or just characters who aren't super likable, I try to make them seem like real people. So even if
mhm,
Ryan is getting on people's nerves, as I've heard many times, I tried to make him seem more than just like this angry cartoon character who you hated. So I just that people are complex, and sometimes people do things that aren't so great, but it's usually it there's at least, even if they're in the wrong, there's usually some reason in their mind why they're going in that direction.
I certainly can see two real brothers in in this dynamic and some real authentic conflict there for sure. But I guess the big thing then, Harry, where will people be able to check out your film?
Yeah, of course. So right now, because it's still Enter the Room's getting pretty close to being done with its festival run.
Okay.
I'd say it will mostly be done by the end of the summer. There may be a few more festivals I tack on in the fall.
Mhm,
Once it's done, so this is actually my first professional short film, so I'm
mhm.
a little newer with the distribution side of things, but the initial plan is going to be to try to get it on one of the popular YouTube streaming channels.
Okay.
Um, However, even regardless if it gets onto one of those or not, it will likely end up on my Vimeo and YouTube pages. Um, and yeah, I mean, so its timeline still isn't set. It could still be another year or so, maybe a bit more. But in the future, you can always follow me on my YouTube page, my Vimeo page. If you Google Harry Waldman filmmaker, those should come up, especially the YouTube page right away. And yeah, if anyone is interested, feel free to subscribe to those pages. And between that, my social media handles, which I'm constantly posting on, there will be updates when the film is finally released publicly.
Awesome. And, you know, I think one of the nice selling points about a short film as well, it's like this is 15 minutes. So it's not a huge time commitment either, and it's certainly worth an experience. So keep your eyes out, everybody out there. But first of all, thank you, Harry, for chatting about your film and sharing your experience. Now, let's get to know you a little bit more as a film lover. So, jumping into my questions here, everybody's favorite question to be asked who loves movies. What's your favorite film?
Yeah. So my favorite film is by excuse me, made by a very well known filmmaker, Christopher Nolan, but actually one of his earlier films that
Mhm,
it's I think a decent amount of people know about it, but not everyone. And is a film called Memento. This, well, I mentioned loving movies for as long as I can remember.
mhm,
I This was the first film that really almost broke my brain.
mhm,
I watched it for the first time when I was in seventh grade, and it actually was not a film that my friend and I picked out. His parents were watching it, and they were partway
okay.
through it, and they were like, "Hey, you guys should sit down and watch this. Like, it's really interesting. It's a little confusing, but." So we sat down, and especially going in partway through, maybe not the best idea, but I just remembered when it ended, thinking, "Okay, I really am not sure what happened, but that was that was incredibly interesting. I was very engaged in the story and the character, despite the fact that I came in partway through. And I'm thinking I need to see that film again. So fast forward 2 years, and I'm at a Blockbuster back when those still existed,
Yeah.
and I stumble on Memento, and I think, oh, like thinking, oh yeah, I've been meaning to watch this again, and I just never got to it. So I take it out. I think I was able to rent it for 7 nights, and I believe for 5 nights straight I watched it, which even my favorite films at the time, I never could do that.
Mhm.
Especially at that age, I mean, I still love a lot of blockbusters to this day, but especially when I was in elementary, middle school, most of my favorite films are blockbusters, and some of them absolute classics, but not necessarily a movie that I needed to watch 5 days in a row. With
Mhm.
Memento, it took me two more watches, plus I had to do a little bit of digging online. And once the kind of twist at the end happened, or once it
Yeah.
resonated with me, I was truly blown away. I didn't realize at the time of my life that a film could kind of challenge you that much and just pull the rug from underneath you. So even after that, I watched it 3 more nights in a row, and I feel like Nolan does such a good job dropping all these Easter eggs. So just seeing some little hints, maybe some actor or actress just making this like micro expression or making this
Mhm.
little comment that wasn't even a part of the main story, but that just made me think, oh wow, like I didn't catch that. So it really was just like putting this extraordinary puzzle together. And yeah, and most importantly, that was the first film that got me interested into more than just watching films.
Mhm.
That was Shortly after that, I started doing research on Christopher Nolan and kind of understanding, like, oh yeah, the director, they're pretty important. And that sort of led down this rabbit hole of me watching, going past just blockbusters, watching all different kinds of films, and then eventually pursuing filmmaking.
Absolutely. And Memento is a very special film. It's certainly the kind of film that it might take you those 5 nights in a row to really like piece this all together and find all those details. I remember watching it for the first time in a cinema class in high school, actually, and just kind of being blown away by it. Because if I remember correctly, my first experience with Nolan was Batman Begins. So, and then being able to see that, and I'm a huge fan of Christopher Nolan, and I have a very visceral experience watching like The Prestige for the first time, and just being like my mind completely blown by the time that film wrapped up. But he's definitely one of my favorite filmmakers, and I have a very good friend of mine who Memento is her favorite film, and she could talk your ear off about it. So I'm sure you two would have a very lengthy and very passionate conversation about it for sure. But it is a great film, and for those that probably know Christopher Nolan for a lot of his more recent films and stuff like that. If you haven't seen Memento, you should definitely check it out. Now, Harry, thinking about what's your earliest memory of going to the movies?
So my earliest going, it was interesting because when you'd first, mentioned this
Hmm.
question when we had been chatting, it took me a little while. I suppose because I've just watched so many movies. It
Hmm.
was for first film seeing in my house. It was an easy. I remembered seeing Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the
Hmm.
Lost Ark, but then in the theater, yeah, it took a little while, but it came back to me. I was very young, but was seeing The Lion King, which
Nice.
is still one of my favorites. I do remember, and I've had this conversation with many people, and this ultimately is a compliment to the film, is that it's pretty dark and it's pretty heavy. And I remembered
Yeah.
as a child loving it, but really being like, I don't know if I want to use the word disturbed, but being
Hmm.
hurt, being in a little bit of pain, but also loving the film from when I was a kid. But just that it was because I was very young, I was maybe 5 years old, that it was
Yeah.
almost a bit much for me. But it's a film that I loved as a kid. I will never forget the first time I saw the scene with the hyenas. And just the entire film, the scar scene, of course, and just that character is phenomenal. Um, but yeah, and then a film that I've watched as an adult and even learn to appreciate even more, and just how much, especially the fact that it's an extraordinary animated film that children can love, but it's so much more than that too, in my opinion.
Well, and especially when you think about like this is an adaptation of Hamlet. And it's like this kind of thing. It's like Disney was on a roll because like, yeah, we're gonna, adapt Shakespeare and feed it to children. And it works. It has those darker edges to the story because like Hamlet's not light entertainment. And it's certainly a film that really sticks with you for sure. And I do appreciate like I feel like a lot of people our age specifically, it's like those Disney movies growing up and like seeing those as kids really left a big impact on us for sure. But thinking about a couple of more favorite questions, do you have a particular favorite genre of movies?
I do. So before I get into my very favorite genre, I've definitely learned, especially over the last 10 years or so, while I love genres from all films, it tends to be the wilder, wackier stuff that
Hmm.
gets to me the most. With that being said, so I especially I love horror, fantasy, and comedy as not my initial favorite genres, but when you sort of add that to any genre or
Hmm.
have that mixed with another one of those genres, it's just something I generally tend to react very positively towards. With that being said, my favorite genre, and it's been this way for a while, has got to be science fiction. Um, I think I think with sci-fi, it's just the atmosphere, the music, the set designs, just the premises I get so into. It's with sci-fi. It's well, I like to think there are plenty of good and great movies I like, but like many others, there's some movies I love that I'm not necessarily super proud of, but it is what it is. And I think with science fiction, it's I even can recognize that I'll watch some random sci-fi film and it might be considered to be kind of a lousy film, but I'm just so sucked into the world and the premise that I love the film regardless.
Well, and I think that's really a sign of like if you love a genre that much, it's like you just enjoy the experience, even if it might not be the best executed version of that experience. It's just the motifs, the elements to it. And sci-fi is also my favorite genre of film, and there's just so many things that you can do in terms of themes to explore with all different types of stories that you could explore. Like I know I even made a comment about your alien poster behind you, but like what they've been able to do with Alien in terms of mixing horror and action and these different kinds of genres in and getting very creative, and like I know a lot of people have a lot of feelings about Prometheus, but really expanding that like mythology around it certainly was daring and interesting for sure from Ridley Scott. So I'm also a big fan of sci-fi and just how versatile you can be with what you can explore with it. Now, I know we definitely talked about Christopher Nolan, but who's your favorite filmmaker?
So yeah, this is excuse me. This I'll actually give a two-part answer, and I guess
Okay.
you mentioning Nolan, I'll segue into I would say earlier in his career hands down my guy.
Mhm.
From I mentioned Memento blowing my mind. Excuse me. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier. I know you brought up seeing Batman Begins. I saw Batman Begins in theaters probably a year or so after I'd revisited Memento. I had no idea it was him, even though I
Mhm.
mentioned I had looked him up and done some research, but I still wasn't looking up directors exclusively that often. And I had remembered the Batman films I grew up with. They were fun, so I don't want to bash them, but I grew up with Batman. It was Batman Beyond and Batman and Robin. So
Yep.
that was what I was exposed to, and they're fun, kind of silly. Didn't take themselves too seriously, but not, especially in middle school, as my taste started to evolve a bit. Not stuff I really wanted to revisit. So just Nolan introducing this newer, darker, more serious, and just well written, really well acted. And I thought the way they showed how conveyed how Batman became who he was, I think is just done so phenomenally. So yeah, I was blown away by that. So then I see the credit roll and it says Christopher Nolan, and I immediately noticed and thought, wow, the guy who did Memento made this. So I started following his every film from that point on. And yeah, I mean, he just didn't disappoint. You mentioned The Prestige. That's another movie, excuse me, that absolutely blew me away. Inception, one of my favorite films,
Mm.
definitely one of his most ambitious. So yeah, early and of course The Dark Knight, which is my favorite comic book film and a film that really pushed me to the brink. And just Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker is
Mm.
still one of my absolute favorites ever. So yeah, while I still love Nolan, I that was kind of peak Nolan for me. Later, as he's made more films, I've been a big fan, but I've noticed that he has shifted his focus a little from his characters to more about to something more conceptual.
Mhm.
So I still liked a lot of his new films, but as that's happened, there have been a handful of other directors that I've sort of gravitated towards, especially as I've watched so many films. And so to answer the second part of your question, which is the now who's my favorite director, when I'd seen this question, because it's changed hands quite a few times,
Mhm.
I'd have to say right now, and especially with his newest film coming out, which I'm definitely seeing in theaters soon, it's Bong Joon Ho for me.
Yep.
um, I the first Bong Joon Ho film I saw was this, not as well known by mainstream audiences, but was this crime thriller Mother, which absolutely blew me away, particularly the way the final act. But everything I've seen from him, especially some of his, I mean, Parasite, of course, phenomenal film. But I think I actually like Bong the most when he gets a little wackier and more unhinged.
Mhm.
Snowpiercer was a film that I didn't know much about. I had seen that was one of his earlier films I saw, a movie that absolutely blew me away and that I just enjoy watching more and more. And I love the sort of kooky dark comedy that he mixes into his films. Okja, I had an absolute
Mhm.
blast watching. And yeah, I mean, this new Mickey 17, you can't always tell a film's going to be from the trailer, but just based on some early, not spoiler, but reviews I've read and based on seeing the trailer, I think it's going to be my cup of tea. So I'm really looking forward to seeing it. I believe I've seen 7 of his films, and I've never seen one of his films that I didn't like. And I love quite a few of his films. So I'm really looking forward to seeing this and just more of what he brings in the future.
Yeah. Bong Joon-ho first came onto my radar. I remember seeing a trailer for Snowpiercer, and I didn't wind up seeing it in theaters, but I rented it immediately when it came out on VOD and was just blown away by it. And it's still one of my favorite films. It's such an interesting concept and very much so such an interesting mixture of tones in terms of and just such a great cast of characters to throw onto like this crazy very violent visceral train ride in the apocalypse. And I distinctly remember like Parasite was such a big experience when that film came out. And even going back to Memories of Murder, that blew me away. I remember sitting thinking like this is some top tier crime thriller. You have those moments when you watch a film and you just realize I just watched something special. Like this wasn't just like me checking something off my watch list. I'm like I watched something special. And that certainly was my experience with Memories of Murder. And I'm certainly excited for, as we're recording this, I'll be seeing it in a couple days, a couple days early, and I'm very excited to see Mickey 17. Um, and this one's been delayed a little bit, so I'm happy that it's finally coming out for sure. Now, thinking about in front of the camera, do you have particular favorite actors or actresses?
Yeah, so another two-part, I suppose.
Hmm.
For a long time, and he's definitely still one of my favorites. As with many other people, Leo DiCaprio was one of
Hmm.
my guys. I love those wound up, uptight, super intense, neurotic performances. I think when I was real young, he was known as the pretty boy in Titanic, and that is a performance that has grown on me. I mean, I always liked it, but I think when like young boys being like, "Oh, like I'm too cool to like this and this character." So while that performance has grown on me, I when I really became obsessed with him was after I watched The Departed, which is still one of my favorite films of all time, and I think that was when his fan base, particularly probably with younger guys, just skyrocketed.
Hmm.
And then I mean all the performances since. Blood Diamond. He's so good in Django, The Revenant. I
Yeah.
mean, The Aviator. I could just go on and on. And even one of his earliest films, but one of the last films of his big ones that I saw was What's Eating Gilbert Grape.
Mhm.
And he is just. I mean, again, he's somebody who I've always been extremely impressed with, and he's still arguably there, but for a while he was my favorite actor. The second one I'm going to list I was always a fan. I think it's because, and there are a few of his films that are some of my favorites. Maybe because he wasn't in quite as many of my very favorite films as Leo. It took me a little while to get there, but just watching this man act, Daniel Day Lewis,
Mm.
I just he like There Will Be Blood was the first time, and that is my favorite film of his, and that has got to be one of my five, maybe three favorite performances of all time. He goes to a level that I feel like almost no actor ever has. His level of dedication, how he disappears into the role, and how versatile he is. Excuse me, is just absurd. Um, and he's one of the few actors where everything. I mean that I've watched. I don't know if I want to say most, but a large percentage of his films. I've watched films that he's in where I didn't really have any interest in seeing the film just based on the
Mm.
subject material. I watched it for his performance, and almost every time I ended up enjoying the film just because of him, even if nothing else.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Daniel Day-Lewis, and There Will Be Blood's one of my favorite films, and that is a performance for the ages for sure. And it's so big, it's so grand, it's so intense and so committed. And he makes some of the wildest scenes in that movie just feel so real and uncomfortable. And it's an interesting point that you brought up. I remember when they announced like he was going to be retiring and he was doing Phantom Thread. And I took a step back. I'm like, on paper, this movie does not excite me at all. But then it's like it's Paul Thomas Anderson and it's Daniel Day Lewis, so it's going to be something interesting. And I don't know if I've ever seen contempt be expressed so perfectly from seeing an actor watch somebody butter toast, from watching Phantom Thread, and just his facial expressions. And it's real easy to just like take him for granted and his performances, but like he could easily won a fourth best actor Oscar for that film. And I know like that was a big year for Gary Oldman, specifically with Darkest Hour, but like Phantom Thread, that was something special. And it's all in the looks and just how he engages in that film. And that also wound up being a much more twisted film than you might expect to. And I'm just like, well, that's the Paul Thomas Anderson here. Now I understand why he made this film. But no, Daniel Day Lewis for sure. And Leo, it's been it's been very interesting seeing him evolve over time. Because like I even remember watching like The Quick and the Dead a lot when I was younger, and like he was the handsome young character in that movie too. And then you see him in, I really think it was The Aviator was that first role where you're just like there's something else going on here. And just the way that he expressed the OCD of the character and just that discomfort. And like even something like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, just watching him be so neurotic and just on the brink of just breaking at any given moment. It's so entertaining to watch, which is so interesting because, he's such a movie star, and yet he could play a character who's this fading light that is so neurotic and unsure of himself so authentically. So now I know you did literally watch Memento again and again and again and again, but is that still a film that you would literally watch every day, or do you have another film you want to say?
It Yes, I did go through that period with Memento, and even though that there's a good chance that will, excuse me, remain my favorite film for the rest of my life, I could not watch that film every day. This was
Mm,
an option of all the ones kind of written out. This was one where I really had to think because, on the one hand, while I love watching movies so much, I think I have a good attention to detail, so I can really appreciate watching something over and over. I really crave variety.
yeah.
So some of my very favorite films, including Memento. Memento, I actually haven't watched in quite a few years, and I probably should revisit it again because I'm
Mm,
just watching new stuff all the time. There's
yeah.
just so much content out there. So yeah, it was tough. What I ended up coming up with, and I actually haven't watched this film in a number of years and should revisit it. But there was a film that one of my best friends in high school we would watch constantly. Like I would
Mm,
say with him maybe once a month, and then I would usually watch it on my own at least once a month. Is the Truman Show? It's
nice.
and I think the reason why with something like a Memento, it's so heavy, it's so like a
Mhm,
spoilers, crushing, heartbreaking at the end that it's just not something. Well, I love those types of films as much as any, maybe more so. It's not something I would want to digest every day. Whereas the Truman Show, very thought provoking, very challenging, but also very humorous,
mhm,
very satisfying and easy. It's a film that it does so many of the great things that some of the more tragic films do, but then it's just easier to digest. I always walking out, I always just feel great, and then can go on
mhm.
with the rest of my day or night. So that is one of the few, and I would say that was my number one film that I feel like I could just watch it over and over, day after day, and I think I would still be good with it.
I distinctly remember watching that movie when I was pretty young for the first time and really enjoying it. And then as you get older, really understanding like the weight of what this film's trying to explore. Cause like on the surface level, you can just enjoy it for, Jim Carrey just being fantastic in it and going along with Truman through this wacky story. But no, the catharsis of that last good afternoon, good evening, and good night certainly just leaves a feeling, and the music swelling and that fantastic last laugh where everybody's just like, oh, what else is on? And just which is so real in terms of how people are now, especially now in terms of you know content and stuff like that, and just like, oh well, what's the next thing? It's such a special experience, so I could certainly understand that for sure. Now, what's a film that you feel like you connect to closely because it relates to another interest of yours?
So I would say that this was another one that was a little tough because I initially thought, oh well, should I pick a film, about filmmaking? And while I
Yeah.
have seen a few films about filmmaking that I really like, I wanted to pick one of my very favorite films. So I kind of moved off that. Then I thought, oh, maybe even though I was never very good at sports, I've always liked watching sports, and it was
Mhm.
a bigger part of my life when I was a kid. So then I kind of veered to, oh, should I pick a sports film? And while there are a few sports films I like a lot, again, none of my very favorite films are in that category. So what I ended up coming up with is I would say not so much one of my favorite hobbies, but just something I can relate to on so many levels, just because of the time I grew up in, is The Social Network. And
Mhm.
just with, I will not say I'm passionate about social media, but social media is such a huge part of my life. Facebook got really popular when I was in high school. So I know people who are a little younger than I am, they were even past Facebook. It was almost
Yeah.
like 5 years after I got into Facebook, everyone's kind of like, oh, Facebook's not cool. But just really, especially I got it first my senior year of high school, and a lot of my friends had already had it for a few years. And it did seem like this new, cool, kind of special thing, and just way to connect with people, and like, see photos if I was at a friend's party or something, and like someone tags me, and that excitement I would receive. So I think I really resonated on that level, and just with the internet in general and technology and how things have changed. It was very relatable to me. I also, like many others, I had overall a very good experience in college, despite the whole roommate thing. Definitely one of the better and happier times of my life. And there just aren't, I feel like, especially in the 80s and 90s, well, there are some college films I've enjoyed watching. There were too many that were, it's like, oh yeah, this is kind of funny, but kind of offensive and tasteless and just like the same
Mm,
stupid joke. So it was nice seeing something like The Social Network, where the, excuse me, the setting takes place on a college campus, but it's so much more than that. So,
yeah.
so I think that's a film. And then just going into the actual film, I mean, the writing, that is probably still my
Mm,
favorite script of all time. Sorkin at his absolute best, in my opinion. And just watching Jesse Eisenberg as Zuckerberg, I mean, that was actually, I didn't mention before, in Enter the Room, while the character was loosely based on my roommate, his mannerisms and facial expressions and the way he would speak, I tried to not completely copy, but I used Jesse Eisenberg's character as a rubric. And I told everyone we were casting, that's what I'm going for. And I told the actor, Peter, that's what I'm going for.
mm,
And that was part of the reason we cast him. He had that interesting voice. He, a nice guy, very professional, but pretty neurotic in real life. So
mm.
he was a perfect match. So, and just the whole story in general was, I definitely resonated with Eduardo and was heartbroken to see what happened to him. And, yeah, I mean, just everything about that film. It's so entertaining from start to finish. All the technicals are fantastic, the acting, the writing, and it has that emotional punch, which I didn't expect when I started it, that some of the crazier, more genre bending films have. So, yeah.
Yeah, I distinctly remember making a Facebook with 2 months left in high school because I spent so much of high school being like, "Why don't you have a Facebook?" I'm like, "I don't want a Facebook," and then I finally caved and made one, and then I went off to college, and at least it was people were still using it for a little bit. But now Facebook has completely shifted gears into, my mom uses Facebook a lot. But I even remember like I never had one, but like MySpace was such a big thing when I was younger. And I work at a college, so I hear students talk about like the amount of time they spend on Snapchat and stuff like that. I'm like, yeah, you all are doing that stuff. I'm sitting here on Letterboxd. Um, you know, different kinds of social media and different priorities for sure. Now, who's a movie character you feel like you connect with on a personal level?
Right. So this is an interesting one because
Hmm,
of all of my answers, this is probably the most out of left field. And this
okay.
is one of these films where I don't, people who really know me and have seen the film might not be as surprised, but it's a film that most people don't know of. All right, anyway, I will just say it. It is a character named Lewis, and it's from an animated film called Meet the Robinsons. Now, if
Nice.
you're, yeah, and it's a film that I think a lot of people haven't seen. I don't think quality wise it's the greatest film, but it's a film I really resonate with. Now, while I have two loving parents, I didn't grow up um, parentless like Lewis does, which is part of what causes the trauma
Hmm,
that leads to who he is. I just really resonate with him. His head always being in the clouds. He's
hmm,
but in the beginning, kind of not knowing not knowing what he's looking for, and then he has these inventions he makes. He's getting interviewed by all these parents to potentially adopt him, and they're asking him what sports he likes. And while I do like sports, I
hmm,
spent a lot of my childhood feeling very lost, feeling like I had friends but that I wasn't connecting with them, whether they were talking about, I don't know, just certain things that didn't interest me, particularly in middle school and high school when everyone was just talking about girls all the time and I was just thinking about other things. um and just his very, he gets tunnel vision. He'll get this one idea and he just goes 1,000 miles per hour, and he almost is a bit reckless about it, where not hurting anybody, but maybe neglecting a friend here, neglecting a roommate there. And I've
Mm.
sometimes been there with my family and my friends. So yeah, he's just a character that I've watched the film over and over, and I don't want to say we're the same person, but it does freak me out a little, especially from all the films that I when I was reading
Mhm.
this question, because I was thinking there were a handful of more popular, well-known, and quality wise considered to be superior live action films I could have picked, but I just don't resonate. I couldn't think of any character in any of those films that I resonated with as much as this character.
My wife would be so excited somebody brought up Meet the Robinsons. She is a humongous fan of Meet the Robinsons, and it's a charming little film. It is in that weird, like, what was Disney doing in that era of their animation in between, kind of like towards the very end of the 90s into the early 2000s, and then like Frozen and Wreck-It Ralph were the ones that kind of like brought them back to like getting a lot of attention. But it's a sweet little film. It's weird. It's so random, like all the stuff that goes on in this movie. I do appreciate that T-Rex though, big head, little arms, and everything. But Lewis is such a charming character too, and I think he's one of the main reasons why the film works as well as it does. And interesting bit of casting for Tom Selleck to show up and just voice this character that I would never expect Tom Selleck's voice to come out of uh, towards the end of the film. But no, I can understand that, and that's a character that certainly hits like that certain level of like I know myself, and like I'll tell him like I found another project, and then I'm like I need to get this project done, and like I'll hyper fixate and commit to it. But just a few more questions left. Now, what's a film that you love that you feel like would surprise people?
Yeah, so this was another one where I was really thinking about it. I was literally I have a letterbox list of my favorite films, and I had to
Mhm,
start scanning through it because initially I thought, well, I could pick Meet the Robinsons was on the short list, but I wanted to
mhm.
pick something else because of course, we just
Yeah.
talked about that. There were some other animated films, not so much the classics, but some
Mhm,
that are a little more random. I thought maybe I could have picked those, but I felt like people who know me, even though I make darker, more disturbing stuff, my friends or acquaintances or just people I'm in film Facebook groups with, I'm very vocal about animation and how much I like animated films. So I thought maybe let's go in a different direction. So the film I came up with, excuse me, is I'd say by film buffs, especially ones who watch more older films, watch more
mhm.
foreign films, they'll know of this one and it might surprise them less. However, I'd say especially people who are a bit older who and I get it. A lot of younger people, a lot of people generally they watch films that come out in or around the time period that they're around.
Mhm.
And while I don't watch as many older films now, and not because I don't want to, just because I'm always trying to catch up. Like I'm currently catching up on 2023 films. I'm a little
Yeah.
behind. But I went through a period in college and in my 20s where I was just watching 1940s, 1950s, 1960s films. Anyway, is a film called Umberto D. And
Okay.
this was a film I saw the reviews, I saw the scores, very highly graded. I went in though pretty blind, and I was sucked in
Mhm.
5 maybe 10 minutes max into it, and I kept feeling more and more for this poor character who just you know can't catch a break, is about to be out on the or is out on the street, is running out of money, and then that cute dog who is one of my favorite pets in any film ever, and just the build up to the end. And I love the fact that sometimes simple, not even to take anything away from it, it's not the
Mhm.
most complex film I've seen, but sometimes simple can be better, and it's just done so effectively. In that scene at the end, I don't want to spoil for anyone who hasn't seen it, but just I'll say the train, that that scene really got to me, and I just remembered like my whole body was on fire. I was so moved. That was
Mhm.
one of the strongest emotional reactions I had ever had watching a film. And that's one of those films that I need to be in a certain mood because it's not obviously not an easy watch. there may be some tears being shed, but
Mhm.
such a cathartic film that I could just watch over and over if in the right mood. And I really feel like I can't pick out a flaw from that film.
This one's on my obscenely large watch list, for sure. And you know, from the director of Bicycle Thieves, that's a pretty nice gateway into like, okay, this is certainly going to be a film worth checking out. I do enjoy some Italian cinema too. So this is one that maybe I'll bump up a little bit higher on my list to check out a little bit sooner, which it's nicely streaming on Max. The go-to of like if you want to watch anything classic, it's probably on Max. Um and no, I don't get paid by Max, but I would like to if Warner Brothers wants to. But Harry, my last question for you. What do you love most about movies?
Yeah, so this one, what was interesting was I had to think about this one a lot just
Mhm.
because there's so many things I love about movies, but I
Yeah.
think the answer wasn't quite as tough for me as the others. So yeah, as I'd mentioned, I just if someone asked me what I loved about movies, then I would be like, oh God, I'm gonna have to write like a 20-page essay.
Yep.
But I would say the number one thing, and I mentioned it a little during Umberto D, but during some of these other films, is the emotional charge I receive.
Mm.
I would say that while there's so many other things, I love being sucked into worlds. I love trying to dissect complex characters and their motives. I think especially some of the villains and anti-heroes, just
Mhm.
because just seeing how did that character get to where they are? How did they do this? Um, yeah, the worlds as I mentioned, seeing characters go on adventures, overcoming, being challenged intellectually. That's something like a Memento, or particularly having some crazy twist at the end where you just feel like you were shot.
Mm.
But I'd say, yeah, the emotional charge is just something, and it's really the wide range of emotions. I would definitely
Mm.
say catharsis is one of the strongest feelings for me. One film I didn't get a chance to mention in this interview that I was sure I was going to, it just didn't
Mm.
quite get there, is Toy Story 3. That is one of my very favorite films of all time. The only reason I didn't list that was in contention for a film I could watch every day, but I just thought the film is it's so bittersweet, but there's so many moments where I'm
Yeah.
emotionally being pushed to the brink that I thought maybe that'd be a bit too much for me to deal with every day. Um, but yeah, it's just dealing with that mixture of negative and positive emotions, and walking away from a film, especially while there's so many different film endings I love, but something like a Toy Story 3 ending, a Shawshank Redemption ending, the
Mm.
Dark Knight ending, and just feeling like you were hurt, maybe even partially crushed with some of these films, but also feeling more whole and just kind of walking away almost feeling like a better person and like a more whole person. So I would say that. And in general, I've kind of said to people like I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie kind of
Mhm.
when I was younger, I definitely spent more time doing things, trying to please people I didn't that didn't necessarily deserve it, doing things I didn't want to do, and now I'm much more I do it respectfully, and I try not to hurt anybody, of course, but much more live in the now and just kind of enjoy the moment. And some of my favorite experiences are some of these, watching some of these films for the first time, or maybe even the second or third, and just kind of emotionally being blown away and just feeling like I'm in heaven at least a short period after the film ends.
Yeah, I you bring up Toy Story 3. I graduated high school June 2010. And that was like literally like I am graduating high school with Andy. And I don't like how this makes me feel. And that film just it's hilarious. It's so emotionally impactful. But yeah, just reflecting upon I just rewatched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is a film, one of my favorite films, but like God, that gets such a visceral reaction out of me every time I watch it. And the way that film can do that to you and really capture that kind of feeling of whether it's, the catharsis of like the end of the Truman Show that just makes you feel like, yeah, pump your fist and then move on to the next thing, or something like that that just really captures that feeling. But Harry, thank you so much for, humoring me, answering all my questions. But I always like to wrap up my show by having my guests ask me a question. So what would you like to ask the Wasteland reviewer?
Yeah, I just figured I thought this over and I was thinking kind of old school. What did maybe even two part? What sort of got you into watching movies? And then what was I apologize if this is kind of two instead of one, but they I guess sort of tie into each other. What got you first into watching movies and what was the first film that you ever truly fell in love with?
So I have been watching movies as long as I can honestly remember. And like I distinctly remember going to see Space Jam when I was like at that point I think I was 4 years old. Going to see that. And going to the movies or just watching movies. I had VHS tapes and it was just as far as I could recall back, just loving watching movies. And I think it was, I'd have all these Disney tapes and watching those growing up. I was the 7 or 8 year old that would obsessively watch James Bond movies. Have I had almost every single one of them on VHS and now have every single one of them on Blu-ray. And there's just there was a peak moment when I think I really, really realized how much I love movies. And it was when I was 10 years old because the year 2001 was pretty formative for me in terms of movies. Because I remember seeing Shrek in theaters for the first time. And I unabashedly love Shrek and Shrek 2. And they're some of my favorite movies. If I need a laugh, they're it. Like I will and also, it's pretty bad. I can quote the whole entire first Shrek movie from start to finish. Um, but I just remember seeing that in theaters with my mom and my aunt and my cousins. And then later that year, seeing Fellowship of the Ring in theaters and Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And also being a young Italian American kid and my grandfather making me watch The Godfather when I was 10 years old. It was just like that was the moment where it was just like something really clicked with me. And I distinctly remember sitting there just loving Shrek every single second of it, watching Lord of the Rings or Fellowship of the Ring, and loving the first 2 hours of it before my aunt had to take us out because she didn't check the runtime before she took us to the movie. The last thing I remember was Frodo getting stabbed by the cave troll. And then I had to hear from a classmate on Monday about that there's still an hour left in the movie. But it just those were some of the like key moments for me that really felt like there was a spark. And then, I watched so much Star Wars and Rocky and Indiana Jones growing up, having those DVD box sets and stuff like that. That's how this whole entire collection really started, were like those box sets that really set things off. And, it was really high school with that cinema class, and I joined film club in college that kind of changed it from like I love watching movies to I love film and really shaping things. But no, for as long as I can remember, it's like the beginning of Goodfellas. As far as I can remember, I just wanted to love movies. That's basically what it felt like for sure. But I appreciate your question because it's fun reflecting back on like watching those movies for the first time and just having that spark of like, this makes me happy. And, this isn't my what I do for a living, but it basically feels like another job because I commit a lot of time to doing stuff like this. But Harry, thank you so much for coming on and chatting about your film with me, as well as, telling me a little bit about yourself when it comes to movies.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. I'm also so glad you brought up Lord of the Rings. That's another one that
Mhm.
maybe I only didn't include it because I just thought everyone knows about Lord of the Rings. But like every other human being on planet Earth, I don't have a bad thing to say about that trilogy. And I even thought for the everyday, that was another one. Like I could put any three of them in, but maybe they're a bit on the long side and a bit emotionally draining in the best way
Mm,
possible. So I ended up moving off them. But yeah, no, it was amazing talking to you. And yeah,
absolutely. And for all you out there, make sure to keep an eye out for Harry and his work coming out your way. But thank you as always for tuning in and supporting your Wasteland Reviewer.